Today, I want to talk about something that's become really common in youth sports over the last couple of decades: sports specialization. To start, let's define what we're actually talking about. Growing up, a lot of kids played more than one sport throughout the year, maybe baseball in the spring and the summer, basketball in the winter, soccer in the fall. That used to be pretty normal, but that's becoming less and less common today. Now more and more kids are picking a single sport, sometimes as young as 6 or 7 years old, and sticking with that one sport year round, often training and competing in it for 11 or 12 months out of the year. Shift hasn't happened by accident. A lot of parents and coaches genuinely believe that specializing early gives kids a competitive edge, whether that's making a travel team, earning a college scholarship, or eventually going pro. Because of that belief, youth sports culture has shifted more and more towards early, intense specialization. So today, I want to walk through what the research actually says about this topic, specifically looking at injury risk, how researchers are studying specialization, and what the research shows about long-term athletic performance. Let's start with how researchers even define specialization, since that's actually a little bit more complicated than you think. Clithers, in a 2020 research summit that brought together sports medicine experts from across the country, defined a specialized athlete as someone who trains intensely in a single sport while excluding participation in any other sports. That same summit pointed out that specialization isn't just one clear category. It actually exists on a spectrum ranging from athletes who play multiple sports casually to those who focus mostly on one sport but still dabble in others, to athletes who are fully single sport and training year-round. Now that we have that definition, let's look at what researchers have found when it comes to injury risk. Eagle, in a 2026 study, used a fairly new method of visualizing data called a swimmer's plot, which allows researchers to track injury patterns and timelines for individual athletes over time, rather than just looking at overall averages. Using this method, the researchers were able to get a clearer picture of when and how injuries tend to occur in athletes who specialize early. This lines up with the findings from Fabricant, who looked specifically at musculoskeletal injuries, meaning injuries to muscles, bones, and joints, in specialized youth athletes. That research found that athletes who specialize early tend to experience significantly more overuse injuries compared to athletes in multiple sports. Overuse injuries happen when the same muscles, joints, or movements are repeated over and over without enough variation or recovery time, which makes sense, since specializing in one sport usually means repeating the same exact motions over and over and over, whether it's pitching in baseball or a swing motion in golf. Beyond just physical injury, researchers have also studied whether early specialization actually leads to better long-term performance outcomes, which is often the whole reason parents and coaches push for it in the first place. McClellan, in a 2022 study, specifically examined professional, elite, and Olympic level athletes to see when those who specialized early actually had more successful or longer careers than those who didn't. Interestingly, the research found that early specialization did not reliably predict long-term success. In many cases, athletes who played multiple sports throughout their childhood performed just as well or even better at the elite level, and in some cases had longer careers overall. Now, it's worth mentioning that the research isn't entirely one-sided or simple. Clithers pointed out that the risks associated with specialization can vary quite a bit, depending on several factors, including how much training volume an athlete is doing, their age, when the sport is that they're specializing in. For example, sports involving repetitive single-arm motions like baseball may carry different injury risk compared to sports with varied movement patterns. This means that specialization itself isn't necessarily an all-or-nothing issue. The actual risk level can depend on a lot on individual circumstances. There's also a practical day-to-day side to this conversation that's worth mentioning. 2019 study by Matskin and Garvey looked at specialization from a more clinical, on-the-ground perspective, discussing how youth athletes and their family weigh the decision to specialize, and what healthcare providers are seeing as a result. So to bring it all together, research on youth sports specialization points to a few consistent findings. First, specialization is difficult to define simply, since it actually exists on a spectrum rather than a fixed category. Second, multiple studies, including a work by Agel and Fabricant, have found a connection between early specialization and increased injury risk, particularly overuse injuries. Third, when it comes to long-term athletic success, McClellan's research found that early specialization doesn't appear to guarantee better outcomes. Multi-sport athletes often perform just as well or better at elite levels. And finally, the risk tied to specialization can vary depending on factors like training, volume, age, and sport type, meaning it's a more nuanced issue than a simple yes or no. Overall, research paints a much more complex picture of youth sports specialization than a lot of parents, coaches, and athletes might initially assume. Thank you.